Welcome to actually we're down to our second last week for this particular version of the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Open Online course. This is the third year we've been running it, and we've had a great group of guest speakers addressing a variety of issues around analytics and the challenges that they face or that they present to educators and others involved in the teaching and learning system. One of the areas that has not received the amount of attention that I think it deserves to have received to date is obviously around privacy and ethics issues. That's fortunately a topic we're going to tackle here, and I think we're privileged to have Abelardo Pardo joining us in this particular conversation. He is with the School of Electrical and Information Engineering at the University of Sydney. Let me just drop in a quick link to his profile on his website. He has also been actively involved. I know he was at the first conference that we held in Banff, and we met him again last year, and looking forward to seeing him again in a few weeks' time in Leuven. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to you and deal with my audio issue. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, George, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this session on practical privacy issues around learning analytics. Let me just start apologizing in advance in case I have too much background noise. I tried to find the quietest venue for a Friday morning here in Sydney, and there might be a little bit of background noise, so apologies for that. So let me start first clarifying a little bit, because this privacy issue, as George said, is very controversial and it needs some careful handling. Let me tell you first some of the things we're not going to be doing in this talk. We're not going to be talking about general issues or a generic analysis of privacy in any context. We definitely are going to use some definitions and some examples that might be useful for learning analytics, but the point is to go straight to practical issues, to narrow down. I'll present you 3 cases. I'll present you a few principles that should guide your questions. So rather than trying to delve and solve and sell once and for all these issues, which is probably not realistic, what we're going to do is basically narrow down to learning analytic context, review the most useful principles that are emerging now around us, and we're going to go straight on trying to see and explore a little bit the practical consequences when we consider these issues. I didn't mention that at the beginning, I should have, but these slides are also available in SlideShare. I uploaded them yesterday night, so they should be available to you in case you want to follow them in a different platform than Blackboard Collaborate. Okay, so as a consequence of this talk, don't be surprised that instead of answering a few questions or a few doubts you might have about learning analytics, it'll happen exactly the opposite. We'll generate more questions. And that's okay, it's no problem, as long as we focus these questions to a much more clear view of the learning analytics landscape. So the objective of this talk, or by the end of this talk, I hope you can get a collection of questions that you should ask yourself when deploying a learning analytic context, and perhaps you will identify additional issues or additional ramifications that you didn't consider so far that it's worth considering due to certain other reasons like current legislation and so on. So let me first start a little bit stating the obvious. We are about to deal with a delicate issue, and this is something that everybody knows. The discussions about ethical problems around learning analytics typically appear in every single conversation. The point here, and this is, you're going to allow me to give my engineering view, okay? I'm an engineer, and therefore I am very much driven by the search of a solution. And one thing that I observe very often is that this discussion about privacy entangles very quickly and sometimes prevents you from reaching a practical solution. And this is something, again, me being an engineer is something that I have to struggle quite often. So my practical approach is, let's get something, let's get a solution, let's get some initial point. And the issue is very delicate, it has an infinite amount of ramifications, but we need something to get it started. And then, of course, as we typically engineers do, we deploy all sorts of refinements and reviews and improvements. And I think it's a good approach to see exactly the problem from inside. Okay, granted that we might get some delicate positions or might come across some special situations that are not pleasant. But I think within certain reasonable bounds, it is worth adopting this approach to then reach a solution and advance and refine these problems. Okay, so let me very quickly tell you the three main blocks that I'm going to talk about. First, let me give you a little bit of the environment surrounding privacy. These are things that you probably might be already aware of, but it's also good to bring them up quickly to make sure that these things are on the table to guide the discussion. So a little bit on the description of the environment. Then we're going to delve a little bit on a general view of privacy. What's out there? What kind of legislation? Again, we're not going to get into details. We're going to extract the main guidelines from these legislative efforts and whatever is interesting for us. We're going to stop a little bit on the medical area, again, not with too much detail, but because medical area has been dealing with privacy issues for quite a long time, and they have a very interesting consequences and very interesting debates that are very enriching for the learning analytics community. And then finally, we're going to focus on narrowing three learning analytics scenarios. I chose these three scenarios because they touch on three specific areas that I think they have different learning analytic ethical approaches that are worth exploring. Okay, so let's start describing a little bit the environment. One thing that pretty much everybody is aware of is how easy it is right now to collect personal information. It used to be the case in which, knowing about what other people is doing, when are they doing it, it was complicated. It was something that required a huge amount of effort, and therefore it was very unlikely to run into these type of situations. But today, and this is an example that I'm showing in the slide, it is actually the opposite. It's very, very easy to collect huge amount of information. This is an example of the blog by Stephen Wolfram, the person behind the mathematics program. He has been collecting an incredible amount of personal information for the last 12, 15, 18 years, I don't know. This graph you see at the bottom of the screen is one dot per each of the emails he sent or received over the last 18 years or something like that. And as you can see, this is a very detailed amount of information. It's being shown to provide some sort of feedback. You can get some interesting consequence there, like maybe sleeping habits, because you can see this band there where no emails are being sent. But he also collected not only the emails, but also the number of steps that he took every day, the number of meetings scheduled at different times. And from there, you can gather or you can collect some consequences or some analysis. But the main point here is that he did that when the technology was not entirely ready, but it's a good example to the type of information that we will be able to collect, or actually we are collecting right now. Because knowing when you send every single email is not that far-fetched from the point of view that most of the people use these web-based email applications, and therefore all that information is collected there. Not only the dates and times in which you send email, but also the content, who are you talking to, and we can even get into issues like detecting your emotions from your text. So this is something that is already there, and we have to just deal with it because it's going to increase. A couple of curious examples just to tell you how far this type of information is being collected and used. This is an example from last year in which a store looking at the purchasing habits of a customer. This customer happened to be a teenage girl. The system deducted immediately that this person was pregnant, this girl was pregnant, and then the shopping chain Target got itself into a little bit of a problem because the father considered that impossible, and therefore thought that the shopping chain was addressing the wrong type of publicity to the girl. And the story ends with the father apologizing because, yeah, they were true. So collecting this information and exploring the shopping habits of a customer gave this company an insight that was not even present for the father. So this is an example of maybe a little bit extreme, but it's the type of information that is out there, and most importantly, the type of consequences or the type of analysis that can be performed. Another interesting one, a recent TV shipped into the market by Samsung that has some sort of technology to detect your face, which is something not far-fetched, especially if you think of cameras that already do that. So the technology is right there. And from your face expression, there are certain things that can be deducted, not only when you smile, but also how many people is in front of the TV, these type of things, okay? The technology is there. It is not clear what kind of information is this TV collecting. It is not clear what is this information used for. And as you can see, the ethical issues, I don't think we need to explain them any further. If you have a television that is looking at you rather than you watching TV, is the TV watching you, then there are lots of things that can come to our minds immediately about privacy. Another way of looking at privacy that actually popped up from a comment that I heard from George Siemens a while ago, and it helps understanding a little bit how privacy is shaping, is to consider privacy as a currency. So I want you to think as privacy that everybody has in their pockets, no matter what they do. You have certain things that are private, and I want you to think of that as money. You have money in your pocket. And the way things are shaping in the internet in general, and specifically in learning analytics as well, and applies perfectly, is that when you access certain services, instead of paying with money, you actually pay with privacy. And therefore, some services will require from you certain information. And the most interesting part when you consider privacy as a currency is that you might perceive certain services as too expensive. Not too expensive from the point of view of regular currency, but from the point of view of privacy. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The connection, of course, between privacy and currency is something trivial because there are several companies already collecting data, and these companies were and are very skillful at translating that data into money. But I'm not referring, this is an example, this company, there is a business-to-business data marketing in which certain companies collect huge amount of data, and then those companies make money selling that data to someone else. So this is something that I think it is already happening at a quite large scale. A different story is how aware is people of this market. But when I refer to privacy as a currency, I don't refer to this connection that some businesses make between data and money. I'm talking about some more subtle example. This is one I took from New York Times a while ago, in which a car insurance company decided to put a sensor at the engine of their customers to track their driving habits. And that would potentially reduce their premium, their insurance premium. Now, the interesting part here is that at the very last moment, the device that they was installing the engine, it would include a GPS. But in the very last moment, they decided to remove the GPS option. And this is a very interesting example because it shows very clearly how privacy can be handled as a currency. You are an insurance company and say, look, I will lower your premium if you let me explore how you drive, or you let me, I was about to say, spy how you drive, or let me watch you while you drive. But you have to put a price tag on that. So GPS or no GPS on that sensor would be a different amount of privacy money that is exchanged with that company in order for you to get a lower premium. So what they decided was to remove the GPS tracking mechanism and focus only on certain magnitudes directly obtained from the engine. That was it. And they thought that by taking out this GPS, the amount of information they collected was still useful, and much more people will opt to install this device. This was something voluntary, okay? So you have an insurance company, and if you want, they'll give you this device, you put it on your car for a month, and after a month, they'll analyze the data and adjust the premium based on the data. But the funny thing, or the most interesting thing, is that the GPS option was removed, but it was perceived as a too high price for privacy and the customers to pay in exchange for this. Okay, so this is the kind of environment we are dealing with. And learning analytics has to be aware of all these forces moving back and forth, privacy issues, because now we're talking about a very specific context. Learning, students, courses, and we have to be aware of all these conditions. So let's take a look at what's out there in terms of regulations, or how are other institutions regulating this. And again, I could be a long time talking about this, but for the sake of simplicity, moving to the examples, I'm just going to go very quickly. This slide that I'm showing right now, I thought it was very interesting because it collects many issues that are already around. This is first a capture of the web page of one of the multiple institutions that have appeared to deal with privacy issues. In this case, it's the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Now, I'm not so much interested on showing what the institution does, but on the fact that these institutions appear very regularly in the recent years. And the reason for that is because privacy is something that is emerging kind of like a struggle. There has to be some watchdog watching what you're doing, and there has to be some entity that needs to check if you're complying with certain policy. So these organizations are very good resources to start exploring the issues. They give you certain documents, and it's actually something that it's very rich in terms of the information they can give you specifically to users. Now, the reason why I like this slide as well is because this institution is actually providing access or the link to a PDF, which is a piece of legislation put forward by the Obama administration. And as you can read in the title, Consumer Data Privacy in the Network World, Framework for Protecting Privacy and Promoting Innovation in the Global Digital Economy. It's actually a very interesting document in which you can see the main principles that should be taken into account when dealing with consumer privacy. So this definitely is something that affects learning analytics, something that should be taken into account. And once you go through those documents, you very quickly come into these main principles that should be observed, that are not as concrete as you would like to. And this is something that will come across fairly often. It will be difficult to find detailed information on how to deal with these issues, but instead you will find certain principles that you have to apply. And we're going to cover a little bit of that. And the third thing interesting about this slide is this box that appears up there telling you that this site is using cookies. Those cookies are being used to store information and asking you if this is okay with you, and there is a privacy statement to learn about more. And this is of course not surprising because it's an institution that is dealing with privacy, but it's interesting because this box you see up there is the result of the latest legislative efforts in which even cookies, which are stored in your browser, as probably most of you already know, are being considered privacy related, and important to make users aware that these cookies are being stored, that they are being tracked, this type of thing. So this is the landscape that we are facing, we have to be aware of. Similar legislation you can find pretty much all over the place. I give you here a couple of examples. This is in Canada, an institution called the CSA Group, and there you can find, perhaps not as explicit as in the Obama administration, but there is a model code for the protection of personal information that was proposed by the government, and it's good to read it also and to get the main principles. Recently in Europe we already have some legislation, but it has been undergoing certain refinement process to incorporate certain improvements. And this is also an interesting example because it tells you how dynamic this field is. Even though there is some legislation from some years ago, main regulatory institutions feel the urge of going back and add certain things. Now the problem here, as you can see from this article, is that whenever these legislative bodies get together to create new laws, of course there are certain pressures or lobbying efforts by companies in order to make sure that these policies are okay with their current business. So again, there is this push or a struggle between companies that have certain interests and legislation that is put forward. Before getting into learning analytics, let me be a bit more or explore a little bit more detail in this medical area. Medical research is an area very interesting because it has been dealing with privacy for quite a long time, and it has some extreme cases that are worth considering. There are certain publications out there already arguing in the medical area that absolute confidentiality, which would be something you might be thinking about, learning analytics, it should be confidential, it should be highly confidential, or even absolutely confidential. Well, in some areas like medical research, absolute confidentiality was declared undesired as a generic term. And there is a lot of research papers discussing the type of situations in which absolute confidentiality should be not considered, or it's not advisable because it has certain important consequences. And I'm not going to get into details because we would need to enumerate a few things. But I think most of you can think of learning situations in which absolute confidentiality could be probably not the best way. Like, for example, when you really detect that a student is very distressed, and it might be advisable, even though you have some confidentiality, to contact some counseling services to step in. Okay. Medical area discussed at length data ownership, which is one of the main issues that we will see. And also, they dealt with information flow, who access what. And you can find examples very detailed on, for example, if an X-ray is created, if the technician running the machine with the X-ray is allowed to take a look at those X-rays, or they should be forwarded directly to the doctor, and the doctor is allowed to take a look at those, but only the doctor treating the patient. The data ultimately should belong to the patient or to the hospital. All these issues, again, the medical discipline is very good because it gives us very good examples for these things. Another interesting factor within the medical context is the fact that, well, we tend to think that whenever we collect information, we should inform people, we should tell them, that we are about to do these procedures, and we should obtain the consent of the user. Well, just a brief example to let you know that sometimes in medicine, even the uninformed consent is considered. It is a very controversial matter. You can find lots of papers discussing in favor or against it. But just to give you an idea that there are certain areas out there that even collecting data from people without them knowing about it, it's something that under certain special circumstances might be granted. This is dealing with disease outbreaks and things of that sort. Okay. What is the main difference that Internet poses with respect to other contexts? Well, before Internet, or before we got into these significant technology advancement that allows us now to track everything, privacy was approached from three main areas. First, we have to make sure that we limit surveillance, and again, I'm talking about privacy in the context outside of Internet. There was this issue of restricting the access to information, and then of course making sure that intrusions into private space are reduced to nothing or are eliminated. So that was before Internet came along. Here comes Internet, and these three principles are still valid, but now we have to deal with other issues, like, for example, how is data captured, what kind of technologies we use for that, where is that data being captured, who owns the data, and this is something important because owning the data comes with a bunch of rights that need to be enforced, and how is it shared, because this data now is very easy to collect and send somewhere else, or to collect and sell it to somebody else. And those are issues that appear now with the advent of Internet technology. Okay, perhaps the most significant consideration to take into account when we delve into how users behave in Internet is the fact, and this is something that you can think of about yourself, how do you move yourself in Internet, is that people act in different roles and contexts, all of them in Internet. And this is very important for learning, because what I'm going to argue at the end is that learning, or learning analytics, is going to be one of these hats. Now, what is the main consequence of this? And you can see this already in many applications. Well, you might have a person that is taking this MOOC, for example, and it's very interested in the topic of this MOOC, as it should be, and they interact with people in this MOOC, they post messages in the forum, but at the same time they run a cooking group in another Facebook page, and at the same time they are crazy about art, and they talk about that in their blog, and at the same time they publish their pictures. So in other words, we have, for one single person, we have different roles of that person in different communities in Internet. And one of the crucial observations here is that applications should respect these boundaries. And By now, maybe some of you are already thinking, yeah, right, this is no way respected right now on internet. And this is just to bring this issue because it's something that changes significantly the approach to privacy. When you accept this observation that you're dealing with people that might have 5 or 6 different hats in internet, and you're dealing with one of them, which is while they are learning, then a lot of the things that might create some doubts about you, you take them a little bit more within a more realistic perspective, should we put it like that. Now the bottom line here that I said, and we're going to delve a little bit into that, is that applications then should be aware of this context and offer a privacy policy that is according to this type of structure. And learning analytics is one of them. Let me give you another concept that I think that helps significantly to understand a much more reasonable approach to privacy. This is a concept published by Nissenbaum in 2004 and argues about the need to consider different contexts for users, but those contexts should have the quality of integrity. We would have to strive for defining a context, and again that would be a learning analytic context, in which we have what she calls context integrity. And by context integrity, what she means is a framework to provide how privacy should be dealt with in a specific situation for that context. So if we're talking about learning, that means that privacy should be addressing only privacy concerns. The context should have this integrity. We'll never take data or never do some operations that take these events or information collected outside that context. That would be a breach of the context integrity. And again, even though it's a concept that is a little bit abstract, basically tells you what I said before, that if you have people that have different hats in different contexts, you should be very respectful of the hat or the context in which you are providing services or dealing with privacy issues. The concept of context integrity is actually refined a little bit into 2 aspects that should be considered with extreme care. One of them is appropriateness, and the other one is distribution. By appropriateness, I think pretty much everybody, these are fairly intuitive aspects that we can immediately connect with the context. Now, place yourself in a learning context. You are collecting a lot of information. Now, how can we guarantee the appropriateness of the context? Well, first we have to decide what is collected. For example, if we are talking about a course like this MOOC, would it make sense to collect our heart rate? Probably not. It is not appropriate for the context. We are learning about learning analytics, and therefore collecting our heart rate or body temperature might not be appropriate. Again, this is not a black and white distinction as maybe some of you are expecting. There is nothing like that. It's much more bringing the type of principles that will help you then make that decision. Another important aspect related to appropriateness and therefore to maintain this integrity of the context. What is revealed? What should be revealed back to users? There are certain things that you might collect that you don't want to reveal because they are not appropriate, and therefore you just ignore them. And the most important reflection of all is probably what is valid in one context is invalid in another. And then users and most of the privacy issues you see out there, they derive from this observation. You might collect a lot of learning analytic information in one context, but please, before taking that information to another context, you should be aware about its appropriateness, because what is valid in one might not be valid on the other. And the second category we see in this paradigm, distribution, refers to the flow of information. And this is very important because as soon as we admit that people have different roles and these different roles need to have a very integral context, then what gets moved to a different context when and for what purpose becomes extremely delicate and should be dealt with. The bottom line of this concept, and which I think is very revealing for learning analytics, is that you should be aware you are dealing with data, private data, in a very specific context, and therefore please be careful when you take it outside of that context, because it might rule it totally inappropriate. Okay, so what I'm going to do next, I'm going to show you 3 case scenarios and then a bunch of principles to consider. Before that, let me give you a couple of big flash to try to capture where things are right now, although I'm assuming that the audience has been already attending these sessions of this marvelous MOOC, And therefore, we are pretty much aware of the type of things we are collecting, how are we collecting them. So I'm just going to give you two samples to put things in perspective. This first one you're looking at is this huge effort that is underway in the United States with funding from different institutions. One of them is the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. And this is an effort to collect a fairly large and detailed database of the activities of K through 12 students. Now, this is a big thing because this effort is underway. This database is already being collected. The interesting part about this database is that it's somehow being made available to startups and companies interested in providing services for this K through 12 market. And as you can see from this headline, the student database, of course, is something very appealing to startups because they see a lot of potential to do business. But for parents, and here we go to this integrity of the context, of this appropriateness or this distribution aspect, parents might not think exactly alike the startups. But this is the debate, this is the situation, and I thought I should bring this because it reflects very much the current state of the art and the struggle that is going back and forth between the potential of technology but then the privacy issues surrounding that. This other application is taken directly from my own university, which I am, University of Sydney, and this is a huge billboard, as you can see, announcing to the students that they can download the University of Sydney application. They put it on their web phone and their smartphone, and they can get a lot of things from there, typically, course schedules, information about classes, events, access to the LMS, so on and so forth. Here, my main comment is that we can now very easily, I'm not saying that University of Sydney is doing such thing, but we can very easily observe now students inside and outside of the classroom. And this is just a potential that is out there. Learning analytics, we can make an effort to restrict ourselves only to the learning context, but we can always, it's very easy, we can get information about what happens also outside. Pretty much every application you install in your smartphone has this privacy disclaimer, and if you read it carefully, most of them, they claim that they can do pretty much everything they want with their phone, contacts, messages, internet connection, these type of things. Okay, so let me put forward 3 case studies. The slide contains quite a lot of text as opposed to the other ones, but I try to just set 3 scenarios, very different ones, not entirely detailed, okay? There are certain things that I left out on purpose, but it's just to give you, in this case, like 6 things to think about. Then we'll review very quickly some principles, and then we'll go back to these scenarios to review these 6 elements. So we are collecting data in this scenario while kids are doing homework in a tablet outside of the class. Data is used by teachers to personalize activity, no problem. It's available to all teachers in a school. Some correlation has been computed already of performance versus demographic factors. It is also made available to platform vendors. That would be something similar to what I just described. And these records are kept forever. So these are 6 very quick facts about this scenario. Let me give you a second one, university course. We collect a bunch of things from LMS and mobile application that is out there. It's definitely available to instructors for personalization. So far, so good. Interestingly enough, some data is considered for assessment. Like, for example, we can think of if you participate in the forum regularly, then we'll give you a certain amount of your course grade. Some course might consider do something like that. It's available to university-wide units such as counseling, recruiting, and marketing. The retention versus demographic factors has been analyzed, so the university is aware of these correlations. Students are accessing quite a lot of e-textbooks, and this data is made available to publishers. And the records of all these things are kept forever. Again, this case is not taken from any real university. I'm not claiming that I took this from any real example, quite the opposite. These are totally cooked up, and I just throw in there some facts on purpose to making you aware of the type of things we can be encountering out there. And a third scenario, distance education. Data is collected only with the LMS, available to instruction for personalization purposes as before. Again, some analysis of demographic factors versus performance. As in the case of the university, some data is considered for assessment. Here probably makes more sense because it's an online or a distance scenario. Results are then made available to funding institutions. What I mean by funding institutions is the scenario in which students might get a grant from an institution to attend this distance education. They are being subsidized by these institutions, and they want to know what is the performance of these students. Now, it used to be a case that just showing this institution the final grade of your course would be enough, but now we are facing this situation in which if the institution is already collecting a lot of data, that funding body might say, I want to take a look at that because it's important for me to make a decision. And here I just threw another one, which is probably going to appear, which is the student having the right to request data removal. So these are three scenarios that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. And now I'm going to go very quickly covering two sets of principles. And then we're going to start trying to connect these principles, what we have seen in these three scenarios. The first principles are taken by a very good and recent publication that I found by Slade and Prinsloo. And they claim that learning analytics should follow 5 ethical principles. And the reason why I put this is because I'm going to continue this with my own practical principles, and there is some overlaps and some absences, as you will see. So first, they claim that learning analytics should be a moral practice, and this is, I think, to bring up the issue that you should be aware that there are a lot of moral decisions that have to be made, and the fact that we claim from the very beginning that learning analytics is a moral practice is probably helpful to make us aware of that. Then they claim that a student should be treated as agents at the center of the application. And this is something, again, coherent with what you see out there. The most important part is that students not only should be aware of what is being collected, but they should be part of the whole mechanism you deploy in there. They also acknowledge that data is temporal and dynamic, and this goes back to the fact that whenever you decide something about a student, you should be aware that that decision you make might not be entirely true over time, and might not be entirely true, period. I mean, the fact that you collect a certain amount of evidence that seems to point that your student is whatever label you want to put in there should be taken with a lot of care and never taken as an absolute truth. Same thing about the fourth principle, student success is complex or multidimensional. Basically, bottom line there is you shouldn't trust your data anyway, at least completely, because it's something complex and might not be capturing whatever is happening. The transparency principle is there. We're going to get into that as well. And then the final one, which is interesting, is institutions are obliged to use the data. In other words, not only learning analytics has the potential of helping the students, but they go a little bit farther and they say that institutions that collect information now, they are obliged to use that data. It would be a bad thing if they are aware of, if the data they are collecting made them aware of certain issues and they don't act on those issues. And we have similar ethical situations in other areas. So these are ethical principles that, as you can see very quickly, we can think of the scenarios I just presented. There are certain things that definitely might not be entirely true, or at least they come under a lot of discussion. Let me put forward now the 4 practical principles that we identified to observe. The first one, and in this we repeat the same principle as before, is transparency, but not only from the ethical point of view, but from the practical point of view. And what I refer to is implementation issues when you deploy a learning analytic experience that need to be taken into account to observe transparency. You need explicit description of everything you do, and this is something that will work towards, as we're going to see, your own credibility or your own context integrity. The second one is student as data owners, and this is a principle that has a lot of derivation that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about, but it reshapes a little bit the type of policies and the type of operations that are considered in your experience. Then you should have a very detailed data access policy, clearly stated and observed. And finally, and this is probably one of the most important one, a process in place for accountability and assessment. Who is responsible of every single aspect, because you need somebody to be in charge of that, and also an assessment procedure. Let me elaborate a little bit more on this principle. The transparency principle, in fact, what you're looking for is to deploy a learning analytics application in a way such that this transparency, in fact, what is conveying to the user is your legitimacy. Okay, so it's a means when you are openly transparent, where it is clearly perceived by the user that you're being transparent. In fact, what you're trying to achieve here is the highest amount of legitimacy. So how do you go off and apply this transparency? Well, basically the philosophy is you have to apply it across the board. There has to be clearly accessible information and documentation about what is happening. Now, I want you to think about this term of use that we often click on these applications. Now, are they clear? Probably not. Are they accessible? Probably they are, but as soon as you see the size of the scroll bar on the right, okay, it would take you 6 or 7 hours to read the document, then you realize that maybe everything is explained in that document, but it's probably not clearly explaining in a way that is easy for you to access the thorny or the delicate part. So things like, for example, having a very succinct and clear description of the main issues of the learning analytic systems that you are deploying, like, for example, these are the data we are collecting, this is how are we collecting them, this is how it is stored, and of course then the detailed term of a use agreement included somewhere else. That would be something that will work in favor of your legitimacy on your approach. That documentation should go to aspects such that who has access to the data, which calculations are performed, which analysis are done. That should be also, in the sake of transparency, and should be included there. We take this data, we perform certain averages, we analyze the social network and follow these patterns for detecting who interacts the most in the forum. We cross the information about how you access the course notes with your assessment. These type of calculations should be also described there. And when you push for this level of transparency, then you can realize that the students are much more aware of what is happening. The institution itself is much more strict when it comes to decide what would be worth exploring, what would not be worth exploring, and therefore it should be something that works for the overall improvement of the system. And then another very important aspect on transparency is how long the data is going to be valid and available. And this is a very important fact. The fact that says, the data is kept forever and that's it, is probably not conveying a very good image, and you should ponder between adopting such an extreme case or providing something that makes the user a bit less reluctant to this type of applications, like the data will be kept for 1-2 years. The data will be kept only for this course, for example. That would be also a reasonable trade-off. And these type of things send a coherent message of transparency across the application. The other important aspect considered when deploying learning analytics application is that you should approach it by thinking as the institution borrowing the data from the students. The students own their own data. So it's not that you are collecting these things and they are yours for you to do whatever you want. It's quite the opposite, actually. You borrow the data from the students, and they have the right to access, amend, or even delete the data. Now, this in itself is very easy to understand, very difficult to implement in applications. Like, for example, let me give you an example. Suppose you have a MOOC like this one. We have a very active forum discussion. We perform some analysis of the forum that leads us to conclusions like identifying the students that are more active, and with that information in my pocket, here comes 1 or 2 students and say, you know what, I would like my information to be removed from the forum. Now, you can do that right away. That's not a problem. But what happens with the conclusions you reach after observing the data that was previously obtained? And this is where we get into gray areas here. So if I reach the conclusion that students A and B are the most active in the forum, but I reach that conclusion based on data that now I am being asked to remove, what happened to my conclusion? Does it rule it not usable anymore, or can I still use the results of this? So this example is to put you in the perspective that giving students the right to delete data is not so simple, because you can delete the data, but then you have all the derivatives you computed from the data that is not clear if you should delete them or not. One reasonable approach is adopt a middle ground solution by which the data that you are collecting has certain validity in time. So even though students might request the data to be removed, and you can do so for the immediate data, the data that you obtain or you derive, you can keep that for a certain fixed amount of time. After a while, you delete also that obtained or derived information, and therefore you end up complying with the request of students that want their data deleted. This is a very important issue because, from my point of view, it affects how you design your system. In other words, it's the type of restriction that you should put on top of the table day one of your pursuit of a learning analytics application. So when you sit on that table with a couple of managers and whoever is responsible or in charge of taking this learning analytics initiative further, you sit down and say, okay, how do we do in order to guarantee these rights or to observe these rights or to treat students as the data owners? What kind of measures do we take into account? How do we deploy these systems? So these are issues that need to be considered at the very, very beginning of the design stage. Now, regarding data access policies, and this is something very important because once you collect data, that data needs to be explored. Who explores that data is something very important. And this is, again, another practical principle that should be present on top of the table from day one. Okay? You should identify the roles. You should identify even the time frames in which this data is available. Like, for example, detailed course analysis could be made available to teachers while they are participating in the course, but then after they are done, that window closes, or restricted access to the summary of the data is only available. And those policies, if we cross it with the first principle of transparency, should be clearly available to the students, like who is taking a look at that. Now, we're going to go back with these principles to the scenarios I just described, and you'll realize that these big pockets of questions, so to speak, and I'm going back to the beginning, which my objective was to give you now categorization on where to put the questions. These questions are important, and by the time you start designing your learning analytic application or analyzing those scenarios I described, like, wait a minute, data access policies. If I make available the e-textbook information, as I mentioned before, to publishers, that's something that should be clearly reflected on the data access policy. What kind of publishers, under which conditions, and with the principle of transparency, that information should be relayed back to users. Now, let me digress here for a little bit. I don't know how well am I doing in time, but probably I'm already going over the limit. Let me stop a little bit on anonymization. In most of the papers say, well, data access is an issue, but as long as you do anonymization of your data, or the identification, which is another word I saw in the literature, then you should be okay. And there are lots of examples in which anonymization is portrayed as a process that you do it once and then you let the data float out. You let the data out there. Now, it's a matter of time and up until the point where somebody puts together some other totally or initially unrelated pieces of information and de-anonymizes the data. Let me give you an example. Suppose you have a very comprehensive data set collected in a course. All the students introduce themselves in the forum, but there is one student that joins the course later. Now, you make that data available outside, anonymized, you don't know who is who, but if you come to the fact that this person joined the course later, then you might see that all the students except one participated in the forum the first day of the course. Now, knowing the fact that this student is the one that joined the course later already allows you to identify that student. And this is something beyond your control, okay? So anonymizing data is something you have to be extremely careful, or maybe even discourage this procedure, because sooner or later, you never know, the data might be compromised, and that is something probably the users are not happy with. And finally, the last pocket of questions or principle to take into account when designing a learning analytica application would be accountability and assessment. This is extremely important. You should have every single aspect of your application with a responsible person or a responsible unit. And the other most important one is to embed, and this is a typical practice in like software development or product development, a loop for refinement. You should be continuously assessing your policies, assessing your results, and refining how you go off to inform students. There might be issues that you want to touch on how you inform them, what kind of mechanisms you put in place to collect feedback, how do you treat complaints, how long does it take you to honor the right to delete things. These type of pieces of your application should be under continuous review and with a responsible, clearly identified. So these are like the big 4 pockets that I want to comment on. And now let me go very quickly again over the 3 scenarios that I gave you. So you collect data while doing homework in a tablet. Okay, right away I can think of a tablet as a device that is not only allowing you to do your homework, but you are executing a lot of other applications. How do you make sure you collect only the data that is related to learning analytics? How do you make sure you collect only the data relevant to the application? How do you inform users, in this case parents as well, of the type of data that is being collected? So I'm basically crossing now the 4 principles that I described before with this scenario. Who is responsible of those tablets and the collecting software? Which person can I contact in order for me to make sure that this procedure is being implemented appropriately? The data is used by teachers to personalize activities. That's no problem. What kind of teachers? All of them, or just the ones related to the course at hand? In the point number 3 says it's available to all teachers in the schools. Really? Well, that means that you could check the data of students that are not under your direct supervision, and therefore why would you need something like that? Or maybe it's something a bit more sophisticated, like the derivative measures that are taken from these observations and are being fed to other teachers. You should be aware of why do you do that. Is it necessary? If you compute demographic versus performance factors, people should be aware of that, and you should have a clear statement of what kind of information is available then back to parents, because they might have the right to know from the fact that the data that you are using is data obtained from their own kids, and therefore they might claim the right to take a look at those data, or how is the data computed. In this scenario, supposedly we are making the data available to platform vendors, and this is something that touches on transparency, touches on data access, and if you ask me, it touches also on the integrity of the context. This would be something that might be argued goes against the integrity of this concept. And then, as I said at the end, it's kept forever, and it's probably not a good idea, because keeping this data forever lends itself to lots of issues and difficult to comply with the right to delete data. If you make it available to vendors, then you have to keep an eye on what vendors do with them, and if they use it for some other tasks, or if they sell it to other companies. Therefore, the best policy here probably is relax this being kept forever and give it 1 or 2 year lifespan. This is just some suggestions so that you simplify a lot the compliance with some of these principles. In the university course, let's review that one. You're collecting data from the LMS, which is fairly conventional right now. If you're collecting data from the mobile application, then students should be aware of that. Students should be given the right of amend that data and even delete that. Maybe you have to work out some sort of compromise, and you can exercise that right at the end of the course, or things of that sort. If you're collecting data with a mobile application, does that mean you are collecting for all the courses you're taking, just some of them? Who sees that data? If it is available for instructors to do personalization, what kind of instructors? Because in university we might have lecturers, teaching assistants. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the case that they were master students or PhD students. Therefore, we are stepping outside of the teaching staff, official teaching staff, so to speak. If some data is considered for assessment, then it should be extra clear and transparent to students how the data is collected, how the data is then used for this computation, and this goes back to conventional practices like, having a rubric explaining how do you come to that grade. If it is available to university-wide units like counseling, that should be made everybody aware of that. Recruiting and marketing, especially marketing, what kind of data is marketing allowed to treat? How is that treated? Marketing means that it's probably going to be out there saying 60% of our students succeed in our courses. Based on what? Based on that data you collected from students, and they have the right to amend that. So you should be careful about this type of connections. If the institution analyze the retention versus demographic, do students have the right to know that correlation factor? Do they have to be aware directly of the odds. I was talking to a very important representative from a university here in Sydney, a different university, and she was telling me, I cannot tell the student, well, given our model, you have 20% chance of passing the first year at our university. Because even though it's something that my model is telling me, I cannot go and tell the student something like that. But you have to work out exactly what kind of information should be available for them. This is the case I mentioned before of e-textbook access being available to publishers. Okay, the integrity of your context should be taken into account there, and make sure that this is something that is treated appropriately. And if you keep the records forever, it's probably something that doesn't make a lot of sense, because this information is very relevant to students in a certain amount of time, but then probably, and in order to comply with this, again, this right to amend data, it's better for you to say 1 to X years valid, and then you get rid of them automatically. The last scenario, again, if we review it, is similar to the previous one. Data here is collected only with the LMS. Perhaps the additional factor I put in there, let's suppose that this is a distance education institution that one is very interested in publishing results on scientific publications. So you need some specific transparency measures and making students aware of that. Maybe you have to delve into anonymization with extreme care. In here, we're going to have the issue of making the data set available for somebody else to check my results, and that has to be done with extreme care, because if the students exercise the right of removing data, then I have to know where the data set has been or where it is in order to comply with that right. Making the results available to these funding institutions I mentioned. Suppose these institutions are providing money to students to go through this course, then it should be clear what kind of information is available to them, when, and the right for students to withdraw the data if they consider this information is not appropriate. Okay, so this is pretty much, I probably went too fast over these 3 cases, but this is pretty much my attempt to classify and give you buckets, so to speak, where to put all these policies, and give you a very quick glimpse. Again, we could have been talking forever on the type of categories you should consider, or the aspects to take into account when you delve into learning analytics. Perhaps one very fast way to summarize what I just said. The big game changer is now in the internet era. Privacy has changed significantly, and therefore the policies have to adapt, and they are adapting very quickly, and there are a lot of forces pulling back and forth. This concept of the integrity of a learning context should be a very good vehicle, or I think it is a very good vehicle, to consider what kind of policies are more or less appropriate. It gives you a very good intuitive level of the type of things that you should be respecting. The fact that users, when they come to your learning analytics application or your learning environment, they're just doing one activity out of many that they could be doing, and therefore you have to respect that context and maintain its integrity. You maintain this integrity by observing these 2 first initial categories that we talked about, the appropriateness and the distribution of information. That gives you 2 big chapters to look at. And then finally, these 2 sets of ethical and implementation principles that once you get into the details of those principles, I think you can very easily connect with decisions within your institution or your application, or the other way around. If you're participating on a learning experience, having these principles in mind would also be a good thing for students or for users in general to then interact or start a dialogue with the institution and make sure that the privacy is properly managed, and everybody will end up much happier. Okay, so this concludes my presentation. I'm open to any questions you might have. Looking at the chat, it's already an hour past, so maybe I don't have too much time for that, but yeah, I'm definitely open to any questions you might have.
Well, great. Thanks very much for a comprehensive and broad overview of some of the ethics and the privacy issues related to analytics. I think you've certainly given us a lot to think about and many dimensions to consider it. Does anyone have, you probably have time for a question or two. We try and keep these things to about an hour because, like I said, a lot of folks capture this through the recordings. But if there are any questions, I'll just release the mic for a second. If not, we can wrap up, and I'll put a link into the discussion forum for privacy and ethics this week. So let me just pause and see if anyone would like to either grab the mic or type in a question through the text box. Okay, it doesn't look like it. So on that note, I'm going to end the recording. But before I do, thanks very much, Abelardo, for a terrific talk and a quick run through the areas of analytics that are impacted and just how privacy is changing in general. And I think that's one of the factors that we want to pay particular attention to, especially as the field goes forward and develops. You'll see as well, I just dropped the link into the text area, which will allow you to go to the discussion forum, and if you have any questions and so on, drop them in there, and we can continue the discussion. So again, thanks very much. Hope everyone has a great day and a great weekend.